The other thing, though, that I think we don't do very well in security is that we don't come out of firefighting mode very often. We're so focused on fixing the problems of today, and by necessity, we're in response mode a lot of the time. You've got to look at the statistics around Security Operations Center and alert fatigue and burnout and all of the other stats. We're stuck in response mode because we have a hell of a lot to respond to. We're not able to make the space to step back and get that broader view of not just where is my employer going and what's the 5-year plan for my employer, but where is my industry going and what are the technologies that are pertinent to my industry that are emerging right now? What's the adoption plan within my organization? And therefore, what are the security implications of that adoption, and how do I build a longer term plan?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm the host for today's episode, Joe Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea. And I'm really excited about today's podcast. It's, as always, it's so great to have amazing guests on the show. And I'm joined by no other than the awesome industry rock star, Rik Ferguson. So over to Rik to if you can give us a bit of introduction about yourself, and also feel free to give us some background into some of your hobbies and probably why I refer to you as a rock star.
Sure. It's funny. We none of you know, but we were just talking off camera, of course, before we started, and being described as a rock star. We were talking about age and grey hair, and this is the first podcast I'm doing with my glasses on. I've decided to accept reality and age. So yeah, being described as a rock star at 52, I'll take it. Thank you very much for that. Um, so yeah, I mean, as a result, I suppose, of my advancing years, that means I've been um, around and in the industry for a long time. I mean, my career per se started back in '94, so that's when TCP/IP was still an option, not a default. And I spent over a decade in technical support. So my day job was basically um, people would phone me up with broken stuff, and I had to work out why it was broken, what I had to do to get it fixed again, and also talk people down off the ledge who were extremely angry about the fact that it had broken at the worst possible time for them. But it was, we were dealing with TCP/IP, we were dealing with IPX, SPX, we were dealing with token ring. I was getting people to grab network traces and having to kind of put those back together and work out why something wasn't working. And more often than not, actually, back then, it's probably still the case now. People who are working in support today will probably sympathize. It's because somebody hadn't engineered according to RFC. And I'm sure that still happens all the time today, but that was a really common thing. So yeah, I spent like a decade doing that. And there comes a point in a tech support career when you're too valuable for people to let you go, because you're the person that's been there the longest. You're the person that everyone else goes to for quick answers to save them going through troubleshooting, and you've encountered most problems. So you hit this kind of glass ceiling where you're too valuable in the support role to actually be able to bust your way out of it into something more challenging after you've been there that long. So I had to quit employer and shift a bit, and I moved into security and privacy architecture design. So I was actually, instead of having to fix something that had gone wrong, I could try to design things that were less inclined to go wrong, let's say. And that was for a company that doesn't exist anymore, called EDS. They were acquired by HP
I
some
remember
time ago.
EDS. Yeah.
Yeah, so they were a systems integrator, and I was working on sort of government and law enforcement type projects, mostly around identity and access management, and specifically around intrusion prevention at the time. And then I spent almost 15 years at Trend Micro. And if you don't already know, I started a new role with a new employer in August of this year. So that's been a big change for me. After 15 years in one company, I'm now working for Forescout as the Vice President of Security Intelligence. And it's allowing me to, well, I'm going to do a lot of the same kind of things that you're used to me doing. So I'm here to talk about stuff and engage and do things like this podcast and create research and compelling content, and bring the world of security to life and to light. But also I'm having much more of an influence on where Forescout's going, what the strategic direction is, and how we can, as an organization, think of new ways to approach old problems, because
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest things in cybersecurity, one of the biggest causes of issues for practitioners, but also for vendors, is
Mhm.
complacency. People who look at a problem and look at a way of doing things to say, well, this is the way that we've always done it. We're not going to deviate from that because we're comfortable
Mhm.
with doing it this way. The fact is that use cases change, technologies change, society changes, the way
Mhm.
that your users and your developers and your board members and your investors see what you're doing or approach what they're doing changes over time. So your approach to solving those problems needs to evolve too. And that, to achieve that, you need that kind of, you've got to be able to stand back
Mhm.
from the issue at hand and dispassionately look at it and say, okay, I'm going to unlearn the ways that I was doing things
Mhm.
before. I'm going to approach this problem with all of my knowledge and experience, but with none of my preconceptions, and think,
Yeah.
is there a new and different way to approach this? And for me, switching employers after such a long time at one, and an even longer time in the industry, it's more than 25 years now.
Mhm.
Um, it's really refreshing to be able to give myself that perspective.
Yeah. And I have a question. So for you, I mean, I think changing rules after so long is something. It's is a strange thing to be doing sometimes. And one of the things I've always regretted over the time, and I think most of the audience, I would love them to take a lesson from this, is taking some time in between roles. So my roles, I've always the day you finish, you're starting the next week for a new role.
Yep.
And I always regret not taking some time, personal time, in between changing companies. Is that something you've taken the opportunity to do yourself, to take a little bit of
I was
time for yourself
obligated.
and family?
Yeah, I was obligated to
Yeah.
do it, which is cool. I probably
Mhm.
wouldn't have done, because, like I said, it was 15 years ago when I started a trend, and I
Mhm.
was a very different person at a very different point in my career. I was not in a position to say, you know what, I'm not going to work for 3 months. I mean, who
Mhm.
is, right? Very few people are like. The cool thing about, I'm located in Warsaw in Poland.
Mhm.
Um, Employment law here is such that after you've been, I forget how many, but I think 3, 5 years at one employer, then
Mhm.
you must have 3 months notice.
Yep.
Um, but obviously, you know, Trend Micro didn't want me around with access to information and systems for all of that 3 months, and that's the right thing to do. So that meant that
Mhm.
for a part of that, I was effectively on garden leave,
Garden leave. Yeah.
and that meant I could focus on other stuff. So that's been great. I can't say that I focused on one particular thing and used my time in order to be able to learn to speak Punjabi. I don't know, right? I did
Mhm.
what I wanted to do at the time, which changed on a day to day basis.
Mhm.
Some of it was music related. I don't know if the
Mhm.
focus will tell you what's behind me.
Yep.
Um, some of it was family related. We're in the middle of building a
Mhm.
house as well, so some of it was dedicated to that. But yes, it's been great to have that time
Yeah.
to lose focus on an employer, any employer,
Mhm.
and just take some time to take stock and reassess.
Absolutely. For me, it's always something that I've looked back in my career and the times. I mean, I've been at companies for quite a long time as well, but in those moments where I've changed roles, I wish I took the month or 3 months just to kind of recuperate the energy and get the excitement going. So when you do start, you're starting fresh. You're starting with the energy that you need to. And I think most
Yeah,
in the
you're
industry,
kind
I
of
think,
raring
yeah,
to go. It's like, okay, I've been
mhm,
out of the game for a while
yeah.
now, and I'm ready. Give me a challenge. Let me take
And you get
something on.
rested, and you get
Yeah,
rested, and also get the balance back as well, because I think it's important to do a proper reset
yeah.
during that time as well. So eh, as you've changed roles, what do you see currently? Because a lot's happened in the last couple of years. I think for the first part of my career, security kind of stayed stagnant. It was evolving, but I think in the last couple of years, it's really accelerated and evolved. Where I think one of the great, with Miko stating recently, I think one of his tweets was that we're no longer securing computer systems. We're our computers. What we're doing is we're securing society.
Yep.
I think that was a powerful kind of message, and I think it was a realization that that how security has changed even in the last few years. What do you see the current state of cybersecurity today, and what do you think is kind of where's the places we need to make changes to in order to really catch up and get back on track?
It's interesting. Another thing that Miko said
Mm,
a few years before the one that you just quoted,
mm,
and that's been a thought process evolution of his that it's been nice to watch.
Hmm.
Is that every company is a software company. That absolutely, that trend has continued. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter really what you do, you're a software company somewhere along the way.
Hmm.
And that has led to the point where now cybersecurity is securing society. Arguably,
Yes. Yeah.
to a greater or lesser extent, it always has been securing
Hmm.
society, but only that part of society which is reliant on digital technology
Hmm.
to offer its goods, services, whatever it might be. And the society that forms that group has
Hmm.
been growing until it's become all encompassing. So that's kind of why that's come true.
Hmm.
Um, what I was saying just yesterday, I think it was in a conversation, is what strikes me as being one of the really important things that we have to focus on right now is how we as security practitioners and enterprises, how we learn our lessons.
Hmm.
Because it's definitely true to say at the moment, and I'm thinking specifically about ransomware, but I don't think
Hmm.
this applies only to ransomware,
Hmm.
is that we see the same attack and the same methodology being successful against different victims over and over
Yeah.
again. So the lessons that we're learning in silos of individual organizations. Hopefully, if you get hit badly by ransomware, you're going to learn a whole load of lessons from that. Not just how do I respond to the incident and how do I deal with a ransom demand and how
Yeah.
do I successfully back up my data so that I don't have to, pay the ransom, but also you learn how do I successfully encrypt my data so that it can't be leaked, because
Hmm.
that's become a standard part of a ransomware attack. Hopefully you learn how do I architect and better segment networks so that
Hmm.
lateral movement becomes less possible within that environment. Many lessons can be learned from those, but we learn them right now in silos of individual organizations. So if you've been hit, you learn your
Hmm.
lessons, and hopefully it doesn't happen to you again. But then someone else, even in the same industry vertical as you, because we know that ransomware crime groups
Hmm.
focus on industry verticals. They'll focus on government, they'll focus on healthcare,
Yeah.
for example, education. That knowledge is not, and those best practices are not effectively being shared. Either they're not effectively being shared across industry verticals, or even just across
Hmm.
potential victim populations in general, or they're not being successfully received. I don't know, where the blame squarely lies, and I'm sure it's,
Hmm.
six or one half dozen, as the other, my mum would say. Um, but there is definitely a problem in how we learn from our experiences, good or bad, to be honest. And if we could go some way towards addressing that short term, that would be extremely helpful. The other thing, though, that I think we don't do very well in security is
Hmm.
that we don't come out of firefighting mode very often. We're so focused on
Correct.
fixing the problems of today, and by necessity, we're in response mode a lot of the time. You've got to look at the statistics around Security
Hmm.
Operations Center and alert fatigue and burnout and all of the other
Yeah.
stats. We're stuck in response mode because we have a hell of a lot to respond to. We're not able to make the space to step back and get that broader view of not just where is my employer going
Hmm.
and what's the 5-year plan for my employer, but where is my industry going
Hmm.
and what are the technologies that are pertinent to my industry that are emerging right now? What's the adoption plan within my organization, and therefore what are the security implications of that adoption, and how do I build a longer term plan? But also there are societal developments that have
Hmm.
implications. There are governmental and legislative developments that have implications, and we need to be able to create the space within our profession where CIOs, CISOs have time built into their calendars that is forward-looking time, not
Hmm.
firefighting time.
Absolutely. So it's about creating a fine balance. And you make a very important point. I think it's one of the things that is that structural wise and organizational wise, many organizations still have security into the IT kind of structure and infrastructure departmental side of things. And for me, it's going is that we should start to see a much more convergence of cybersecurity evolving more into a business operational kind of approach, where it's focusing more on the business risk and business resiliency, rather than looking at to an IT technology problem, where something that actually should be across all departments of the organization. We really need to bring down some of those silos, departmental wise, and make sure that cybersecurity gets embedded. I think one of the great things, I think the book. that Adrian and Jessica and Kieran did a few years ago, the ABCs of cybersecurity, which is all about awareness, behavior, and culture. And I
Yep.
really think that, to your point, that we definitely need one is better communication, better visibility, and better longer term thinking. Because that brings up another area that I listened to a talk that you did a while back, which I think that many organizations who are in that firefighting mode, what they end up doing is they incur lots of technical debt,
Yeah.
because in the firefighting mode, you're only looking at what's right in front of you, and you end up choosing a tool that does one thing that solves that one problem. And if you're not thinking more strategically or thinking longer term, or where you need to be next year or where you need to be in 2 years, that technical debt can become a problem for you being able to actually get budget and get resources that you need to then transform or move from those, point solutions or
Yep.
non-integrated solutions to a much more strategic approach. How big is the problem with technical debt today, as a result of this?
So technical debt's an interesting one. It's a term that originally comes out of agile development, and
Mhm,
it's the meaning of it has kind of morphed over time. In its original sense, it was saying that you start a new project, you really don't know very much about the tools that you're
mhm,
using, the thing that you're trying to build because the thing doesn't exist. So you're learning as you go, and as you
mhm,
progress, you use that, and you incur technical debt as you go along, as you're doing this development process.
mhm,
You use the knowledge that you gain through having gone through that process to go back and repay that debt by revisiting
mhm,
and
mhm.
fixing the stuff that you got wrong earlier in the process. That was
Yes.
kind of the original definition of technical debt, that was termed. And it's some argue that it's overused now. I would argue probably that it's not
Mhm.
used enough, because if it were overused, it would be top of mind for people. People would be thinking about it when they make decisions, but
Yes.
clearly they're not. In the way that you described it, it's more now than just software coding development of a product. It's
Mhm,
planning and implementation of a product or a service or an
mhm,
architecture, whatever it might be. And if you're obliged to, it basically it's taking decisions quickly in order to get something out the door to meet a deadline. That's how
yeah,
you incur technical debt now. And whether that's the the product team at your
mhm,
organization has decided that this new service must be released on this date, come hell or high water, then all the teams, and security will only be one of those, responsible for making that happen, will pull
mhm,
out all the stops to get to that drop dead date. And that will mean that they will make short-term decisions. Short-term decision making is
mhm,
the root of technical debt. If you're not in a position where you can accurately build a register of all of those product and
mhm,
implementation and coding decisions that are made as you go through that process of building a service or a product or whatever it may be, then it's effectively like losing track of all your loans and never
mhm.
knowing when your repayments are due or what interest is being charged on those. Because that's the thing with technical debt.
Yes.
Over time, you do build up interest on the debt that you've accrued through your decision making process. So if you're not in a position to be able to pay back that technical debt, there will come a time when it will come back to bite you because of all the interest that's accrued on the decisions that you
Uh-huh.
made. Suddenly you find that
Mhm,
one of the underlying authentication mechanisms for the thing that you built is only capable of handling, I don't know, an 8-character password or something.
mhm.
And then every other thing that that system does is tainted by the fact that the authentication is architecturally weak underlying that.
Yeah.
But because you've built this complex interconnected system on top of that, your now current
Mhm.
ability to repay that technical debt is extremely low because of the interconnected nature of any
I,
change
I
you have to make.
I love that metaphor. It's like having hundreds of credit cards, and you can only use that credit card for shopping at one thing or buying one good, and you lose track of the interest rates and all of those. That's a fantastic, comparison to how you can really see how impactful technical debt can be to an organization if you start losing visibility and losing accountability of all of those.
You end
Yeah,
up with governance
yeah,
issues because you've lost the audit trail or even the
mhm,
decision trail. You end up with really poor strategic alignment within an organization because people are
mhm,
making not spur of the moment, but short term decisions to
yes,
fix issues. And then what you end up with at the end of that, actually, probably one of the greatest interest on technical debt things is you end up having to neglect or delay any kind of modernization on the thing that you've built, because it becomes massively complex
Mhm.
and incredibly difficult to change stuff because it's
Yeah.
all interrelated.
And it could slow down innovation for business as well, because all of that, when an organization is looking to, new business opportunities or new services or new technology that really helps accelerate,
Yep.
sometimes it's like we can't go there because it's not compatible with this, or we would have to do this major upgrade or digital transformation in order to be able to achieve that. So it also can be an impact of not just about incurring costs from a security perspective and stopping you from innovating to newer technologies, but also from a business impact as well. It can actually slow
Yep.
the business down.
Yeah, and it's
Um,
it's inherent complexity, isn't it?
mhm,
If your decision making, it has to be rapid fire because of the, you're being driven in that direction by the way the project is evolving,
mhm,
or the implementation, or whatever it may be, then kind of like you said when we started this topic, is
mhm,
you're deploying point solutions to resolve a problem so you can move on to the next challenge. So right, I've ticked that box, I've
yep,
got a solution in place that offers me that functionality. What's the next problem? And you end
yep,
up with this hugely complex but massively interconnected beast, which is very difficult then to do anything with, whether that's governance, testing,
mhm.
or modernization.
Quick question in this, there's a lot of different deployment models, from traditional on-premise to licensing, and does cloud somewhat kind of reduce the impact of technical debt by making it a little bit more portable, or not, or easier to change, or easier to deploy? Um,
It's a good question. I suppose it depends on the choices you make when it comes
mhm,
to your cloud vendor. If
mhm,
it's something you're building yourself in the cloud, and you have had the luxury of being able to build from scratch, then absolutely,
mhm,
it definitely allows you greater portability. It definitely allows you things like containerization to segment things away along with their
yeah.
dependencies, and exactly what's where. Hopefully, if you're managing it
Mhm,
correctly. When it comes to services from a third party, then of course you need to do that due diligence up
mhm,
front, and you need to request access and knowledge to assure yourself that that is the case. One of the worst things that could happen is that you sign up with a particular cloud provider for a service,
mhm,
and then you find that they're using a proprietary data format, so you're kind of locked into that platform, and you're totally
mhm,
unable to move to another. One of the great possible answers to that kind of question is the question of encryption, which is another
mhm,
technology. Way back early in my career, I was working for PGP,
mhm.
and obviously encryption was a big part. It was encryption and
Yeah,
VPNs, and
yeah.
actually firewalls too, Gauntlet firewall all the way back then. Um, Encryption is still massively underdeployed,
Mhm,
particularly searchable symmetric encryption, homomorphic encryption, all of those much newer advances in the field of encryption. But those sorts of technologies should allow you ultimate portability. If you can drop your encrypted
mhm,
data into a cloud service and it never has to be decrypted because you're using it in its encrypted form, searchable,
yep,
symmetric, or homomorphic, or whatever it might
mhm,
be, then any cloud platform that allows you to drop that data in means that you can pull that data out because it's still your
yeah,
data in your encrypted format, and you can go take it somewhere else at any point. So cloud definitely should improve
mhm,
governance, portability, and at least hide away the complexity from the customer and make it somebody else's problem.
absolutely.
That's the crux of a platform as a service or a software as a
Mhm,
service offering, is that someone else has to take care of the detail.
yeah.
But it's a question of how that someone else. The complexity doesn't go away; it just
It,
becomes someone else's problem.
it becomes another area of physical responsibility.
Yeah,
To your point, it brings up kind of some of the lessons I learned here in Estonia. Was that I remember going into the government, more than 10 years ago. We were talking about software-defined networks. That's the way to go. And the Estonian government went, No, that's yesterday. We're already doing service-defined networks." And I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And they
yeah,
basically went through, and that's when I learned about a new approach. Was that it's not about the software; it's about how the software basically creates a service together. It's about the interoperability. It's about those connectivities, the APIs. It's about the data flow, and ultimately, to the end, it's about the service that you're offering. That is basically a collaboration of all of those technologies together. And for me, that was kind of enlightening. And also got, that's where you start thinking about the bigger picture, to your point, as you mentioned earlier, about stepping back and seeing that bigger picture. But how does everything work together? What's the role? What, do we have any areas of potential fault, failures, or single
yeah.
points of failure that could
That
could
was
impact it?
One of my last pieces
Mm,
of work at Trend Micro was Project 2030, and that's kind of exactly the point of doing that kind of project. Is very rarely in our industry do
mm,
you get a chance to look at something like a 10-year time frame to say
mhm,
what are the potential technological, societal, legislative, governmental changes. Um,
mhm,
what are the implications in terms of behavior and technology of those changes, and what are the implications of that for cybersecurity stakeholders
mhm,
if these things come true, and in
mhm,
all of their interrelated glory? What are the consequences of that? What should we as cybersecurity stakeholders be bearing in mind, and how do we
mhm.
get to build a more nuanced plan for that 10-year timeline? 10 years is a, and I'm sure you know, and
Yes.
probably everybody listening knows, 10 years is an eternity in technology. It's probably twice
Mhm.
as long as that in cybersecurity.
Absolutely. And there's another thing that's kind of one of the things you pointed earlier, and it brought to mind is about how we communicate cybersecurity. I think that's one of the things lessons I've learned in recent years that we really need to. And again, I'm watching as we're doing this. You know, a lot of people are going to conferences, and a lot of the vendors are in the expo halls doing their messages. And for me, I think every time I go to the expo halls, it's a bit of a it's all about fear. It's about scaring. It's about FUD. It's
Still,
about
yeah.
and it's still that, and it frustrates me because I always think about how do we make it positive? How do we start communicating it much more of how does security help the business? How does it help employees be successful? And ultimately, when we're making those decisions, going back to if you're thinking strategic, is about how is what I'm putting in place today? What technology am I replacing, or what process am I placing? And is it better? Is the security implementation of this better than the employee's experience with the older solution? Is it
Yeah, and for
helping
me,
them
a
to
lot
do
of
their
it's
job better?
about visibility and risk. It's
Mhm,
about having conversations that are more visibility focused and risk focused. How do I
mhm,
gain ultimate visibility over everything that I'm responsible for? Because one of the perennial problems for security is that you
mhm.
can't secure what you can't see, and very
Yep.
often our visibility within any organization is incredibly constrained, usually to traditional platforms that we're used to dealing with, whether that's
Mhm,
Linux, Windows, Mac OS, those kinds of things. And we are increasingly, particularly with rapid adoption of 5G, we're increasingly moving to an enterprise environment that is way beyond those endpoints. You think about the kind of stuff that you might find in a medical environment, you think about the kind of stuff that you might find in an industrial environment, or just in a standard office environment to
mhm,
manage lighting and air conditioning and temperature and ventilation, all those kinds of things. They're all connected to the network too. They all represent potential points of entry.
mhm,
So definitely we need to move the conversation onto one that's much more about visibility. And that doesn't have to be about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's just about how do I, first of all, accept that I don't have it right now, and what steps
mhm,
do I need to take in order to uncover and discover all of those things that I'm currently blind to. And then associated with that conversation about visibility, we need to then frame the actions to be taken in terms of risk, because risk in itself isn't a bad thing, and you get to make your own decisions about risk, one of which, and it's
yep,
perfectly valid, is to accept risk. As
mhm,
long as you know about it, it might be exactly the right business decision to make, to say, okay, I'm aware of that risk now, and it's in my risk register, and I accept that risk. Or you might say, I'm going to mitigate that risk, and here's my
mhm,
strategy to do that. Or you say, I'm going to offset that risk and get some insurance or whatever it is, and have somebody else take on the financial and responsibility for that risk because I pay them some money. But you
yep,
have those choices to make. None of those are about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They're about certainty. They're about being informed
mhm,
and then making the right decision for your business.
absolutely. And that when you're mentioning that, I always remember going back to when this was a pinnacle change in my career. It was during a penetration test where I was helping a CISO basically do a penetration test, doing assessment, and we found some vulnerabilities. But when we presented it back to the board, because the CISO wanted basically to get an increase in budget to be able to install some new tools in the following budget year, and we basically the plan was to scare the board to getting the budget.
Yeah.
And it basically, when we went in, we presented it. It was a realization. We actually ultimately the budget was denied, and the CEO and CFO came and sat down and says the budget's been denied. You did a great presentation. You scared us, and we now know a lot more about security. But we don't measure are basically budget decisions based on how you presented. You didn't have a return on investment. You didn't have a tangible value that you were presenting.
Yeah.
You just basically presented the flaws and the vulnerabilities, but you didn't turn it into how does it make the employees' lives better? How does it actually make our customers, with better services? How does it actually, reduce the risk to the business? And it turned into that was the moment. It was a pinnacle moment in my career when I started realizing that my job is no longer. I'm not a cybersecurity professional. I'm actually a person that has skills in that area and knowledge and experience in that area, but my actually job role today is about reducing the risk to the business.
Yep,
And
and
that's ultimately
it's absolutely about how do I enable my business to do more, go faster,
yep,
more successfully with lower risk.
yep.
Those are the questions that you get to answer. It's about the business. It's never been about security, and that's
And
why
that was
security has been in a silo for so long. Because the mindset within security is that it's all about security, but actually, it's not at
it's
all
not.
about security. It's all about the business.
I always get upset when we had the cybersecurity awareness month last year. We had a week that was cybersecurity first, and for me, that was so frustrating because that week, it's not about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is never first. It's always a supporting element to something else. It's
Yep.
supporting to the business services doing or infrastructure or whatever it might be, or the systems or software. But it should
Hopefully
never be
embedded from
first.
the outset, though, right? Hopefully, rather
Absolutely.
than being added on last, hopefully something that is at least on the starting line with all the rest of the project and gets to have a say and talk
And
about systemic risk within any endeavor.
I mean, I think for me, I think the big realization was having the discussion with the CFO. And I think more CISOs and more security leaders should be sitting down and listening to the financial team about how they measure things. Because typically, it's the financial team typically are the ones that's they basically are the common denominator between sales and marketing and development and management and operations. And they typically are the ones that's defining the budgets and the metrics and everything that supports those businesses. I really think that we need to start having security leaders more involved, more embedded, and more listening to how those teams measure their success. Because ultimately, how we help them be successful is ultimately how we should be measuring ourselves, rather than just measuring, vulnerabilities and attacks stopped. We should be measuring how we have helped the business save money or help them improve or better the services. So becoming much more listeners to the business rather than actually loudspeakers of enforcement, which we
A
had been
long
in the
time ago,
past.
when I knew less and was certainly
Mm,
more naive, but probably had a bigger mouth, I I was talking about when do you know that you're getting it right
mhm,
as someone responsible for security within an organization, whatever that job title might be. When do you know when you're getting it right?
mhm,
And I said, I think you're really getting it right when you don't think that you need a security team anymore, when you don't have a
mhm.
team of yours that's directly dedicated to security, when actually your team is embedded in everybody else's team.
Across all.
They
Mhm,
understand the business reasons for why a project is initiated, why the timeline
mhm,
is what it is, what the goals of that project are, and that they are able to facilitate
mhm,
reaching those goals as a part of that team, all with a dotted line into the person responsible for security. I might
mhm.
have known less and had a bigger mouth, but I think my idea was right, and I still stand by that.
Absolutely. And for me, I'm a big advocate of having teams having cyber ambassadors or cyber mentors or whatever they want to call it. There's
Yeah,
different names and different terms that's been used in the past for that. I think that's where you really start embedding security into, and that's where you start also getting feedback and hearing about how they're measuring and also how they're communicating it to the broader teams as well. I think that's really important. And to your point, is absolutely it's all about to getting it where it's part of the company culture eventually. And you're basically just becoming the orchestrator or the conductor of that to make sure that it's fitting to the business. And to your point as well, one of the things I learned from the CFO was also about how they look at risk reduction. Whether they choose cyber insurance or whether they choose to offset the risk, to document it, to accept it, and they always look at what's the cost of doing something versus the cost of doing nothing.
yeah.
If we didn't do anything, what's the financial impact or the impact of the service that we're providing, whatever it might be? What is that impact, and what's the cost of doing something? And they were even the CFO was, depending on the value of that impact of the cost, they'd be willing to spend anywhere 10% to even up to 30%, depending, of course, the size of that. If it's 100 million, they'd be willing to spend 10 million to offset that risk. So they would walk away with 90 million guaranteed, was it financial profit.
And the
So it was
CFO is
always,
the right person to make those decisions, right? Because it is, at the end of the day, it's a mathematical calculation.
yep.
What's the value of the asset that I'm protecting? What's the likelihood that this particular eventuality will come to pass as regards to a threat to
Hmm.
this asset? And what will it cost the business if that comes to pass? And that mathematical calculation allows you to say, well, in that case, I
Hmm.
should be spending upwards of this or no more than
Yep.
that to protect the asset in question currently. So
Exactly.
CFOs are perfectly placed to make those decisions, but security professionals are perfectly placed to give the CFO the data they need to make the right decision.
Absolutely. I think that's the direction we need to be getting. And that alignment, so I was saying, is so important for security leaders to be really working together with the financial team to really get that convergence together.
Yeah.
Where do you think? So, I mean, where do you think the direction security is going? What's our future look like? Because I know you mentioned you did the Vision 2030. I think was that the one you were a spaceman or something like.
Project 2030 was no, that was so.
Which one
Project
was?
2030 was just a look at. We did a baselining exercise of what does the world look like today, and then myself and co-author Vic Baines,
Yeah,
and
which
then
is fantastic. She did the cybersecurity image problem, which is one of the things I'm referring to as well.
she's
It's
fantastic. I mean, that's not the first time that we've worked
yeah.
together, and it won't be the last. She's absolutely brilliant. And then we did a lot of like horizon scanning of what technologies are on the
Hmm.
horizon, uh, what patent applications are we seeing right now. We ended up in Project 2030 talking about things like the metaverse without calling it the metaverse because nobody else had been talking about it until that point.
Yeah.
We'd released it and suddenly Facebook changes its name and Microsoft starts talking about the metaverse, and we're like, wow, that's basically what we're talking about
Yeah.
in this document. So one of the big implications for me, and I think so, when you're writing a document like that, and it was a big one, it was 30
Hmm.
something pages long in the end. When you're in the middle of writing it, you are consumed by the bit that you're working on right now and
Hmm.
trying to make sure that you don't miss any of the threads back to the bits you've already written.
Hmm.
And then when it's finished, you read it with another set of eyes that are just looking for typos and spelling mistakes and
Hmm. Yeah.
punctuation errors and that kind of thing. And then you send it to somebody else. In my case, anyway, you send it to somebody else who can make it look
Hmm.
pretty
Yep.
in terms of images and colors and things.
And good
And
designer
it's
and copywriter.
and it's
So.
not until it comes back from that process where you get to read it with fresh eyes as a document.
Hmm.
And I tried to sit back and before I started reading, I said, okay, the purpose of me reading this now, I have confidence in the fact that I've caught all the stuff that I needed to catch. So
Hmm.
I'm going to read it and try and work out what is the one overriding thing that we were writing about in this document. What's the most important
Hmm.
point of it for me? Um, and what came to me at the end was that what we were writing about is a problem of truth, trust, and authenticity. And I think
Hmm.
those are going to be our biggest problems in security going forwards. How do we distinguish fact from fiction, reality
Yep. Yep.
from fantasy? Um,
Yep.
and how do we maintain an objective record of truth within an organization and within security? Obviously, there's a much wider societal problem that I couldn't even attempt to solve about an objective record of truth.
Hmm.
You have to look at recent historical events to see how necessary that is, but that's not my area. But certainly within cybersecurity, within
Hmm.
an organization, if you're ever going to have an effective incident response mechanism, but also threat hunting and incident
Hmm.
detection mechanisms, you need a good baseline and a means of effectively being able to establish this objective record of truth within your
Hmm.
organization. Otherwise, you never see deviations from that. And that's your early warning
Absolutely.
system.
Absolutely, it's all about context.
Yeah.
I think it's all
Context is
about
king in security.
understanding. Yeah, it's. I think for me, one of the things is if we can bring more sensors and alerts together and collectively make sense of that from context-based security, I think that's definitely where we start making better decisions because we
More
have a
information,
better.
fewer alerts. That would be great, please.
Yep, exactly. That's and we are, there is that path going forward. I think a lot of things with automation, integration, APIs, that's
Yeah.
making that possible. It will come down to humans. You know, AI will have some play in it. I don't like calling it artificial intelligence. I prefer calling it augmented intelligence, or it's more about supporting the human side of things rather than taking over. Because ultimately, I believe that a human will need to create the algorithms. They will need to go through the
Yep.
data. They will need to make the decisions to determine what more can they automate and add to that going forward. But getting to the
We
point
said
where we
within
have, yeah,
2030, actually, one of the
mm,
things within 2030 that's very pertinent to that
mm,
point is that the role of frontline SOC analysts in the future will be more around explaining and validating the decisions taken by a computer,
yep,
because you'll be using machine learning and other forms of AI at the front line to do proactive decision making based on incoming data. But as a SOC analyst, you are going to have to look at the outcome of the AI and decide why the action was taken and whether it was the right action, and
yeah,
what the human learning that needs to then be applied to the machine learning is that comes out of those activities. So
absolutely. You become the conductor. You're
frontline,
just making sure it's staying within the lines and that
yeah,
everything
and frontline SOC,
is
you
continuous
end up becoming a
proving.
data scientist much
Yep,
more so than now, which
absolutely.
is a good thing. Because
Yeah,
another question people are saying, what does that mean? Does that mean that frontline SOC, those jobs go away? And no, they develop and they get better. You end up
they
with
get
a
more.
much more fulfilling role as frontline SOC than maybe you have now.
Yep, you get to work in kind of more interesting things more frequently, rather than, I think I remember when I was in the front line doing
Triage.
security operations, and yeah, it just becomes the same. Every day is the same thing. You just it's like, or you're working in the same thing and you have the same problems multiple times. You're just basically resetting it, rebooting it,
False positive, false positive, false
and
positive, downgrade, downgrade, upgrade. Yeah.
I remember one time somebody came in and said, why is the screen red? It's always red.
Yeah.
It's always
You mean there's another color?
alerts. We're always interested in the green one that comes through once in a while. What was that? Something worked.
Oh,
So
nothing
it's
happened today. Yeah.
something
That's
positive
suspicious.
happened. So and I think that's one of the challenges, that, yeah, the false positives. I think you're absolutely right. I think the skill set will evolve as well. I think the data analysts and data scientists and algorithm scientists will become
Yeah.
some of the most important roles in those frontline, to make sure that we're able to continually kind of future proofing security. Kind of, we're looking at all that intelligent data coming through. We're making sure that we're not just securing of all the things we know about the past, but we're augmenting it to be flexible for the threats that we're seeing coming in the future as well,
Yeah, that's
and be able
that's
to
another
deliver
little
response.
Ferguson soundbite. Is
Mm,
you've often heard it said that data is the new oil, and to a large extent, I agree
yeah.
with that assertion, even though it's very hackneyed by now. But what I would add on to that is, if data is the new oil, then algorithms are the new refineries. Algorithms are what
Mm.
turn that data into a useful product at the end of the day.
Yep. And for me, it comes down to, as well, is that then it gets into automation, which for me, the most valuable asset in this world is people's time.
Yeah.
And that's what the algorithms are all about, is to save our time and allow us to focus on most things that are more valuable in our world, and get balance. So, absolutely.
And then we end
So,
up in the world of Ian M. Rankin's books, where it's the post-scarcity world where humans don't need to work anymore, but the machines recognize that working makes us feel good, so they let us do it occasionally.
absolutely, we're definitely moving to those one hour weeks instead of 4 day work weeks.
Yes, yes, please.
Work becomes a hobby for everyone. I hope that's ultimately the goal. So,
That would be fantastic.
Rick, it's been awesome having you on the show, and really insightful. And
Thank you for
definitely for
inviting
me, it's
me.
always great conversation, always great insights, and everything. I mean, I just want to let you know. I mean, everything you've been doing in the industry is, making the world a safer place. You definitely educate. The videos you do, sometimes you're just standing at the top of Mount Everest or wherever it is, or, but I think it does translate into, making security understandable, and making a much broader knowledge the important things. So, and everything you're also doing in society as well, taking care of people, and some of the things you've been doing recent months, I think it's phenomenal. So, keep up the great work, and look forward to seeing you
Thank you very much. Yeah,
in
hopefully we'll,
events in the near future.
yeah, do
So,
that in person at some point. That would be great. Finally.
absolutely. Any words of wisdom that you would like to leave the audience? Final thoughts.
Yeah, always use moisturizer. It's really dry in those data centers.
Absolutely, and always bring a set of earmuffs as well. Because it can get quite cold. Um, but yeah, absolutely, moisturizer is important. Yeah, not even just in the data center.
Yes.
So, but it's been fantastic having you in the show. I will hopefully everything's well. Hopefully you're all excited about the kind of the journey ahead,
Yes.
and
Looking
I'm
forward to
looking
it.
forward to catching up in person sometime in the future. So, For the audience, again, it's been awesome having definitely the most famous rock star in the security industry on the show today. And really out there, make sure you tune in every 2 weeks for your basically thought leadership, education, knowledge transfer to keep you up to date on all things cybersecurity. So stay safe, take care, and again, many thanks for being on the 401 Access Denied podcast.